past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland, whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome, one and all, to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It is time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Cross Time Pub, where I hear they're serving champagne tonight, as we look at the past 12 months and round out another year in search of answers to humanity's greatest historic questions. As always, I am Micah Hanks, and joining me are the Seven Ages research team, Jason Pentrail and James Waldo. Gentlemen, good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon for that matter, wherever you may be in space and time. How are you fellas doing?
I'm doing pretty well, Micah. How are you doing?
I'm just fine. In fact, another holiday, which for me is just, well, almost another day, except I do all my work really early in the morning, and then I go and see my family for the rest of the day, go home exhausted, and like a man well beyond my own years, I go to bed early. Jason, you have a family? I'm sure you can probably relate.
Yes, always. But more importantly, I'm pondering the historical anomaly of why it's necessary for adults to give other adults Christmas presents.
Yeah. Well, I have a family tradition in my household, and that is, one day when I have kids, naturally this is all going to change, but for the time being, when my mom and my dad, my brother, his wife, and I get together, and whomever else joins us, we had some friends join us this year for the Christmas celebration, but this year we just didn't celebrate in the traditional way, where we gave gifts and did all that kind of stuff. We instead focused on the food, the family, the kinship, and the things that I think matter the most. And honestly, it was really nice. It was really refreshing, because so often I'm stressed throughout the holiday season because I'm running around, I'm on Amazon and I'm shopping, I'm trying to get everybody gifts. And this year, early on, I went to my parents and said, listen, can you guys just help me out? I've been so busy. Give me some ideas about what everybody wants. And Mom says, here's an idea. Let's just forego all that. Right? We're going to buck the system. We're going to protest this consumerism. We aren't going to shop for gifts this year. I know a lot of people would say that takes the magic out of Christmas, but the problem to me is when you focus so much on that consumerism. You're worried about the money that you're spending because everything is so expensive these days. Back in the old days, when we gave gifts, you remember when we would go carve something from wood that we found in the forest, or perhaps we would, make some sort of basketry, kind of like the indigenous Americans and ancient Paleo-Indian America would have done. Make a gift for somebody that you love.
So what you're saying is, bah humbug.
Not exactly. I'm trying to say that to truly get into the spirit of Christmas this year, we focused on each other and the fellowship that so often is lost in the mix.
Yeah, that's a good point. What you run into is when you have children, as I do, I have two, and then, in-laws and all those have children. So we just all agreed this year to just get gifts for the children. Make it about the kids. Let them have fun. We're all adults. I don't need anything. You're going to get a pair of socks or an air freshener that you don't really want to put in your car. Something like that, right? So we all said, let's forego that. But as Christmas creeps ever closer, you find out, well, somebody got something for you and somebody picked something up, and then you feel obligated to buy it back. And before you know it, you've spent a bunch of money on stuff that nobody really wants anyway, and they're all going to return it after Christmas. So there we go.
I remember back when I worked in radio, they asked us, we're going to have a Christmas party, everybody bring a gift. And one of the old gals who worked in the sales department, she was the world's best at buying gifts for people. She would get you like a popcorn machine, or she would get you, like leg warmers or something ridiculous. I don't know where she came up with some of the ideas for gifts that she would bring in. And they were those gifts that nobody really wanted. In fact, they hoped that they wouldn't be the one who drew the ticket that got the gift that she bought for everybody. Yeah, sometimes, I don't mean to sound like ungrateful. I did end up actually breaking protocol and took a few gifts to my family this year. But yeah, sometimes some of those gifts that folks give you, you'd be better off never having seen those, let alone actually receiving them, right? Now, James, look, your kids are all grown up, so you kind of have a get-out-of-jail card on this.
Well, not really.
No.
Honestly, because, my son just got married this last year, and they're kind of getting started out, and they need a lot of stuff. So I ended up spending some money, bought him some tools, just things that he needed. right? But for those people that don't really need anything and you can't think what to buy them, and hear me out here. Just listen, scratch off tickets.
Ah, yeah, that's a good idea.
Seriously. People love those things. And maybe they win some money. Maybe they don't, but it's kind of fun. It's like it's not really a gag gift, but it's a fun gift, and you don't got to spend a lot of money on it, and people enjoy it.
Look, that may not be a gag gift, but that is pretty funny, and yet it's also sort of brilliant. That's a great idea. Yeah. I'd be happy if I got a scratch-off ticket. Yeah.
Yeah, we do that a lot here. My dad loves that kind of thing. He's a casino guy, right? So, if you can't think of anything else to get him, get some scratch-offs. He has a great time, but it's kind of like morphed into like, hey, if we don't know what to get you, guess what? You're getting a chance at casino.
Let me share some wisdom with you. I was in the Big Apple recently, and I had a driver pick me up from my hotel, and he was a gentleman who had immigrated to the United States from Turkey. He told a fascinating story. I mean, he came to the United States, never spoke any English before, got in with some of the Turkish community in New York, gradually learned English, became a driver, and now he makes a really good living. He really has an excellent automobile that's several years old. You'd never guess that because he really services it so well. And when he found out I was from North Carolina, he was like, that's where I want to move to. I've got a friend down there who's got a driving agency, basically a cab service, but it's, professional drivers who drive town cars, things like that. And he said, I'd love to be down there. That's like my dream, is to come to North Carolina. And he said, I've got a friend down there who worked in a gas station. And what this guy would do is every day at the end of the day, there were those second place scratch-offs where people would just scratch off one, and if they didn't win anything, they'd just throw it in a trash can. So this guy who was the owner of this gas station would collect all those out of the trash at the end of every day, and he would do the second play. Lo and behold, the gentleman struck it big one day after rummaging through the trash can at the end of his shift, like he did every day and had done for years. He did one of those second play scratch-offs and won $1 million.
Wow.
Won $1 million. It was in the news, and he said, I'm not kidding. He pulled it up on his phone and showed me, and here's this guy from, I think it was Greensboro, North Carolina, who had won $1 million. And what he did, he immediately invested. He bought a couple of small gas stations, and he invested, and now he is really doing well as a business owner. He's got a whole chain of different gas stations in his town, and all that as a result of playing those second play scratch-offs. So, ladies and gents, that's quite a story in itself, but the real ticket, no pun intended here, had to do with the fact that he was the guy who was going through the trash can looking for those spent tickets that nobody noticed, right? And had thrown away when they actually, had they played the full game, might have actually won some money off those. So he never spent a dime, but he got $1 million, and he was very persistent in reaching that, a roundabout way of making his million, but then he invested it, and now he's doing very well for himself. True stories of success, ladies and gents, and I'll tell you another story of success. That is one that is told in stone, because probably nothing in the Americas when it comes to archaeology is quite as enduring as stone, that age-old and extremely effective non-perishable technology, and hence why we study it so much when it comes to Paleo-Indian archaeology. And the folks out there at Oregon State University have been involved in that recently because a series of projectile points that were unearthed in the state of Idaho, but that they've been studying there at the university, are thousands of years older, they say, than any previously found in the Americas. There are 13 in total. Some are full, some are fragmentary projectile points. And again, I'm looking at an image of some of these. They would be very familiar to you, Jason Pentrail, and I want your comment on this here in a moment. But here's what they're saying according to a recent press release from Oregon State University. The 13 full and fragmentary projectile points, razor sharp and ranging from about 1/2 inch to 2 inches long, are from roughly 15,700 years ago. That according to carbon-14 dating. That's about 3,000 years older than Clovis fluted points found in North America, and 2,300 years older than the points previously found at the same Cooperage Ferry site along the Salmon River in present-day Idaho. And they have now published their findings in Science Advances. I want to quote Lauren Davis, and I believe Jason actually has spoken with him recently, but Lauren says that from a scientific point of view, these discoveries add very important details about what the archaeological record of the earliest peoples of the Americas look like. It's one thing, he says, to sit down and say, we think that people were here in the Americas 16,000 years ago, but it's another to measure it by finding not just artifacts, he says, but well-made artifacts that they left behind. Now, Jason, as our resident lithic expert, I really want your opinion on all this. You've looked at these artifacts. You've spoken with some of those involved in the discoveries. Does this change what we know about early humans in the Americas? If so, how? And what does this really mean?
Well, first of all, it's important to know that while this has recently been published in the journal Science Advances, this is a story I've been following for a very long time. So most people are familiar with the fluted Clovis point. Now, what we're talking about here is generally referred to as the western stemmed point. And Cooper's Ferry site, which is the location where these were discovered, is a very interesting place in its location and the way that it's positioned along the river there. There's a lot of things to consider here when we're talking about this site. So I've been following it for quite a few years now. The Cooper's Ferry site has had excavations ongoing for several years, and they actually have a YouTube channel under that title, Cooper's Ferry site. And on there, you can go look at some of the various digs and field seasons that they've had there over the years. I've been following it for quite a long time. Now, when we're looking at the points themselves, they are fairly small, about 1.5 inches to 2 inches long. However, they were discovered in these 3 pits that are layered with bone. It doesn't appear to be human bone. It seems to be various types of animals, but many of these points are in pristine conditions. Some of the other ones are damaged or broken to a degree, but overall, they're still very much usable. So there's a lot of controversy around it right now, as we would totally expect when you're coming out with dates of this age. One of our former guests here on the show, Ben Potter, has some real issues with the site and the way that the dates have been recovered and the way that they're positioned within the strata there. So we've, again, when these things come out, it's never going to be free of controversy, but nonetheless, the pieces that we're seeing are very distinct, and they are certainly old. And if they're not pre-Clovis, they're certainly contemporary with Clovis. So we still have something else there to consider. Also involved with that is the fact that much of what they're discussing here about the site, so referring to the location, the Salmon River site where the points were found is on traditional Nez Perce land. Now, that particular area and that part of the land is known to be an ancient village of the Nez Perce. So the land is currently held in public ownership by the Federal Bureau of Land Management. And these points are revelatory basically because not only are they of what appears to be an older age, but they are very similar to projectile points that are found in Japan, northern Japan, dating back 16,000 to 20,000 years ago. That's according to the lead researcher there, Lauren Davis. Now, there in Idaho, it is, obviously a long way for something like that to travel. And they're not necessarily saying that they came from people from Japan, but it looks like that tradition may have been passed along as people were coming over. This particular location where it is located, it kind of kicks out as the river basins come down on what we would expect to be the path that they would have taken, that Paleo Indians would have taken into North America. So it's very advantageous to the movement of early peoples. And nonetheless, it is one of these sites that's going to continue to be excavated in time coming, and it's going to give us more clues for sure. But the points themselves, if you're comparing them to what we would consider a Clovis point, they're much different looking. They're very slender. They have 2 distinct ends, one that's sharpened and one that's stemmed. If I had to compare it to something of a closer age, if you've ever seen a very old Adena point, some of the first Adena points that have the beaver tail, they're kind of like that, but smaller and with a more extended blade. But if you want to kind of put something in mind, that's kind of what we're looking at. They are assuming that they would have been used to kill large game. However, we don't know at this point. Again, they were found with bones, so just keep your ear to the ground. There's going to be a lot more research coming, and I have booked Dr. Lauren Davis for the show, and he will be sitting down to do an interview with us here very soon. So we will certainly be able to get into more of the details and find out more about this very exciting Cooper's Ferry site.
So one of the things that I think is extra interesting about this is a good representation of the never-ending incoming tide of scientific knowledge. We obviously have papers being written about pre-Clovis people in the Americas 16,000 years ago. And just a few years ago, there would be people willing to basically knife fight you over the idea that people were here pre-Clovis.
Absolutely. And although the pre-clovis argument has been pretty readily accepted for the last several decades, it is interesting that in recent years we've seen perhaps a bit more pushback than in years past on that point, which seems really to be more of an effort to try and narrow the range, the date range in terms of the earliest arrivals. Look at the most reliable data and set the timeline back no further than that most reliable data. But then extend Clovis, or, the immediate predecessors to the Clovis lithic tradition. Again, that kind of lithic culture, that technological revolution that occurred in the ancient Americas, and extend those earliest arrivals back to kind of incorporate that. In other words, to try and reconcile pre-Clovis with Clovis, and to make the argument that maybe people weren't here quite so early as some proponents of what has been called pre or earlier than Clovis would have us believe. But again, I think that there's quite a good bit of evidence that shows that there were people in the Americas much earlier. We can try to narrow the temporal range and thereby rewrite the history to meet what we expect, but sometimes, as scientists, you gotta follow what the science says. And I'm not saying, by the way, that all the scientists involved with their diverse array of different opinions about this aren't doing that. But the fact that there are an array of different opinions, to me, does suggest that there are some who are perhaps leading not with presumption, but maybe with their own expectations, rather than truly looking at what the data yields. It's yet to be seen where this will go, but with better science and better technological developments that help us determine unequivocally the date ranges with archaeological discoveries as they are found in the years ahead, at some point, one argument or the other is going to have to give way, and we'll either have to accept that people were here much earlier, or that data was misinterpreted or otherwise flawed. I don't think it can be both things. And to me, really, personally, there does appear to be a lot of data that shows people were here much earlier. Now, on the paleoclimatological side of things, there was another interesting announcement made recently by the University of California at Santa Cruz, and I'll just briefly quote from a press release that they posted at their website here. This has to do with the formation of the Bering Land Bridge and how this actually formed fairly late during the Pleistocene. They say a new study that reconstructs the history of sea level at the Bering Strait shows that the Bering Land Bridge connecting Asia to North America did not emerge until around 35,700 years ago, which is less than 10,000 years before the height of the last ice age. The new findings, which were published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, indicate that the growth of the ice sheets and the resulting drop in sea level occurred surprisingly quickly and much later in the glacial cycle than previous studies had suggested. James, I know that you are a bit skeptical about this. What are your thoughts?
Well, whenever I hear something like this or, read a new paper, I don't always buy it immediately because somebody wrote a paper about it. But as I read the article and I considered it a little bit, it's obviously plausible. And the reason I say that is think about, what we know about the last glacial maximum. We hear about stories about ice sheets that are 2 miles thick, and all these incredible data points, but that didn't happen on the first day. Right. When the last glaciation started, it was somewhere late into the event. So it actually makes sense for this to kind of follow those same parameters. So it actually does not surprise me now that I've had time to process it. This may have occurred during the last glacial maximum.
Yeah. Well, we're always learning new things. And again, as they note in the statement that they released with this, it means that more than 50% of the global ice volume at the last glacial maximum grew after 46,000 years ago. And that, by the way, according to Tamara Pico, who is the assistant professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at UC Santa Cruz, also one of the corresponding authors of this paper, who adds that this is important for understanding the feedbacks between climate and ice sheets, because it implies that there was a substantial delay in the development of ice sheets after global temperatures dropped. Now, look, obviously, when we look at paleoclimates, when we understand what was happening during the Pleistocene, this is integral to understanding when the first Americans actually arrived. We have to narrow down the period during which there would have been a feasible method of entering the Americas, if indeed those first arrivals did in fact arrive by passing over land. Again, maybe we could argue that is in itself a presumption, considering that the ingenuity of those early Homo sapiens sapiens, which technologically and in terms of their development and capabilities were no different from you or I, those people very well may have used watercraft. And in fact, there is some indirect archaeological evidence to that point.
I don't know that the glacial development was really delayed because it's a process, right? How do glaciers form? Well, they form gradually, right? So as the climate would shift into a glaciation, basically what happens is during the wintertime, you get significant precipitation. And then during the summer, not all the precipitation from the winter melts off. And then the next year you get more, and it just starts to pile up. And it takes a long time to form these huge glaciers, but it's just a long process. And even the melting, is a long process as well. But it probably takes you 100,000 years to build up a glacier, especially a continental ice sheet that's 2 miles thick. It's a long process.
Oh, absolutely, without doubt. So as these findings are forthcoming and we're learning more about the paleoclimate, it's going to be interesting to see where this goes, not unlike the last study that we were talking about here just a few moments ago. I'll tell you one place where you can learn a little bit about all of the archaeology, the climatology, the geology, from the historic period to prehistory. And that is over at the Smoky Mountain Relic Room, proud sponsors of the 7 Ages audio journal. I haven't managed to be there since back before it got really cold, and it's felt very much like the Pleistocene here in the Appalachian Mountains in recent days, guys. It got down below zero here. No kidding. But I'm sure things are always cooking and keeping warm over there at the Relic Room. Jason, can you tell us what's been going on over there in recent days?
Well, Chase is always up to something, and he's staying warm this time because he was in Arizona. So out there hunting for fossils of all sorts and dinosaurs and all the great things that he does. Sent out some beautiful pictures that he's had on social media. It looks like he had a great time. And of course, over the holidays, as he always does, spending time with his family and having all their traditions there in the beautiful mountains of Tennessee. So as far as the podcast goes, he's got a couple new episodes out, Hunting the Triassic. So really good in-depth explanation of some of those Triassic fossils and how they do it. Also a brief history of Christmas for all of you holiday folks out there who are interested in that sort of thing. 2 great episodes that are available now on Chasing History Radio podcast. And then over on the YouTube, his latest video is called Easiest Fossils to Find 50 Million-Year-Old Plants and Insects. So again, always covering all of history, all of geology, and all the great things that we love here at 7 Ages. And of course, the holidays just passed. I hope everyone had an opportunity to swing by there or to look up great items for your family and friends there at therelicroom.com. Again, we're very proud to have Smoky Mountain Relic Room inside of the Smoky Mountain Knife Works as our sponsor here at this 7 Ages audio journal. So again, if you want to swing by the store, that's Sevierville, Tennessee, or you can always shop online at therelicroom.com, the largest diversity of history for sale in North America.
Now look, if you're one of those folks who does still celebrate by giving gifts, that's a great place to find gifts. But here's another idea for a gift. Consider a subscription to the 7 Ages Patreon, where you're always going to find additional content from the team, especially from Jason, who's always doing extra interviews and analysis, meeting up in the Crosstime Pub after hours. I don't know how they let you guys in there after the actual clock stops. It's incredible.
We hide in the closet. So
is that how you do it?
I'm actually flipping burgers in the back. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, we know all the fine folks there at the Crosstime Pub, so we're always welcome. But yeah, we're putting out some great new content over there, keeping up the Crosstime Pub podcast. We've launched the book club. We're having a good time with that. So again, that is made for you, by you. So everyone there that's a patron on our Patreon channel is welcome to join us for the book club that we currently have going. We have Chris Judge, former guest, archaeologist here in South Carolina, that's been joining us for those first 2 episodes as we explore the 1701 journal of explorer John Lawson and his interactions with the natives of both South and North Carolina. It's a fascinating study, and that's the book that we have been discussing over there. And of course, we're also doing the Dig Deeper series, so we're getting opportunity to sit down with some of the guests that you know and brand new guests that you may not have heard before. No time limit on those interviews, and we just go until we've talked about everything that we wanted to cover, and it's a great way for you to get that extra content over on Patreon. You just look for 7 Ages podcast. It'll pop right up, and join us over there for all the good stuff we have going on.
Excellent. It's always good to hear about everything that's been popping over there on the 7 Ages Patreon. And of course, don't forget to follow us online. You can find all the links to our social media over at 7ages.org, in addition to getting the complete back catalog of this podcast. But now, it's time for us to revisit the Mound Builders series. In this edition, we are going to Parkin Mounds in Arkansas, right over there where James Waldo happens to reside. Nathan Odom will be joining us to discuss the Parkin Mounds here in a moment when we return on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Seven Ages back on the road. Jason Pentrell here. I am live at Parkin Archaeological Mounds here in the beautiful state of Arkansas. Now, I've made my way 9 hours yesterday across from Charleston, South Carolina to Tupelo, Mississippi, home of the king of rock and roll, and I am excited to have made my way out here to Parkin. It was on our list during our April trip, but we were unable to get by. They were unfortunately not open on the day that we were coming through, but I made a mental note of it, and here we are a few months later, happy to be back at the site. So I've spent the morning with my guest here, Nathan Odom, who is a park interpreter here at Parkin Archaeological State Park and has been working for Arkansas State Parks going on 5 years. He holds a Bachelor of History and a Master of Teaching from Southern Arkansas University. Nathan has a passion for history and studying diverse cultures. Now, we've had the opportunity this morning to go around and see the site, and it is truly impressive. I had a good feeling when I was coming here today, Nathan, that I was going to see something special. And again, every one of these sites that we seem to go to, each one of them, they have that same flow going through them, that they're all Mississippian sites for the most part, with a few exceptions, like Parkin Mounds, which is a woodland site, but they seem to all have that vibe of the Mississippian running through them. But this one has, again, unique features. It seems like each site that we go to has its own personality, if you will, and it offers its own interpretation and another example of the Mississippian culture. And so I have learned quite a bit here today. This truly has some unique features. So starting with the location. So we're here on the St. Francis River, and this is a confluence between a couple of other major waterways. So tell us about the property itself and its location here on the St. Francis River.
So the property is 17 acres, and it is directly on the banks of the St. Francis River. And about a mile north of the site, it connected to the Tyronza River. So two major waterways of the area that feed the local agriculture and farming and everything. But they also connect to the Mississippi. So for the American Indians, it would have been a great trade route system. And this is also one of the largest sites on the St. Francis, with about 20 others ones scattered up throughout the area.
Yeah, it truly is impressive. And like you said, 17 acres. And again, while that is a fairly large footprint, the actual living area and the mound area is highly defined by some unique features that, again, I have not seen at any other location. This site has a unique feature in that it has a moat of fairly significant size that comes off of the St. Francis River and wraps around the site. So tell us a little bit about that. Again, I haven't seen that at any other sites.
So for these sites, these Parkin Face sites, the moats are pretty typical of this area. And this site here had an 85-foot wide moat, and it was about 6 to 7 feet deep. And it was dug out by hand using, their stone axes and tools of the day. But it did connect to the St. Francis, so in high water it would have flooded in and flooded the area. And then for a lot of the year, it would have just been a really big, sticky, muddy bog. So definitely would have kept anybody out that they didn't want coming in.
And there seems to be some archaeological evidence of a significant palisade that was on the interior portion of that moat as well. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. On the inside, they found post holes of about telephone-sized pole logs that were irregularly spaced and then woven with cane and daub to make a whole wall.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah. And then you have some great displays here as you move about the park that you can see those representations. What was the purpose of the palisades and the moat? Were they considered to be in an area of conflict? Who are we dealing with as far as that goes?
So this site is Koski, and we believe they were at war for a number of reasons. First and foremost, the moat is a significant labor force needed to do that. So why would you dig a moat of that size unless you're going to be defending yourself? And then also we know from written accounts from the De Soto Entrada, they identified Koski as being at war with Pakaha, which is a neighboring province not too far from the site itself.
Okay, so these are both Mississippian settlements that seem to be in conflict over agriculture, over territory. Do we have any indication of what that conflict would have been centered around?
Not specifically. Probably would have been territory and agriculture because these were subsistence farmers. They were farming mostly corn and some hunting.
Sure.
But as far as what they were really fighting about, we're not too sure.
Well, it's very interesting, again, the layout here. And as like you said, they're scattered out among this river area and throughout the basin. It's hard to say who necessarily would have been on which side with those different settlements as they're scattered out along the riverbanks. But nonetheless, we do see those defensive things that are put into motion here at this site. It makes it very interesting because, again, that's not always present at these sites. And it's really interesting also that you were able to find that through the archaeological method. As far as population size, what are some estimates for this particular site?
For this site, they estimate that at any given time during occupation, there'd be about 2,000 people living here. And they estimate about 400 houses were within the palisade wall.
Okay, so it's a significant site, to say the least. Now, the term, you've said it a couple times, Koski, that was the time, during the time of the Mississippian occupation. Is that what it was called, or is that something that was derived from De Soto?
That came from De Soto. We don't know what they would have called themselves. Like most Mississippians, we have no idea because no written language. But according to De Soto in his chronicles, he met the chief, and the chief's name was Koski at the time in 1541 when he came to the area. And what De Soto did normally is name the town and the province after the chief so that they could keep an easy record of it.
Okay, well, that makes a lot more sense. So what we're calling Parkin Mounds today is actually named for the nearby town, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so at least as far back as the time of De Soto, so the 1500s, Koski would have been the chief and or possibly the name of the town. We don't know, but nonetheless, interesting that we at least have an alternate title for the place that we don't normally have in a lot of these situations. So we're going to talk more about De Soto coming up here in just a moment. But again, painting the picture of life here at Parkin Mounds, something you mentioned to me when we were on the tour that I found really interesting was you said that there was what appears to be a standard unit of measure for the houses that were here on the property. What is that measurement?
That measurement is 13 feet exactly. They found every house site that they've found on the site is a 13-foot square. And it's so exact that in one test unit, if they find a 90-degree angle of the hard-fired clay and they know it's a floor, they can measure out 13 feet to another corner, dig down, and find the other corner. It's that exact.
That's incredible. See, we always have these conversations, and when you go back, people often look at these cultures as if they just sort of threw things up, miscellaneously on the landscape. And oftentimes the details of the advanced version of the culture, if you will, the fact that they were actually using technology and standard units of measurement, all of those things are so vitally important to understanding the culture and appreciating it as being something significantly more involved than what oftentimes people call primitive. Now, that word gets thrown around, and Nathan, I know you personally kind of have a issue with the term primitive. Explain that a little bit. Why does that term not set well with you?
Well, the term primitive implies that they are lesser than us. And the way I like to describe the American Indians that lived here is they were just as smart as and just as advanced, if not more than us. A lot of times we have school groups come through and kids think of these as cavemen almost. So I have to tell them like, hey, if you went back in time and you were living in this area and you had to farm, you had to hunt, you had to build your own house, would you survive? And, sometimes there's the kid that says, oh yeah, I'll survive. I play Minecraft. But other than that, they don't, so they recognize that they were doing these amazing feats of work with this amazing technology of the time that's just as advanced as we are. We just have the benefit of we live in a time where there's been more people behind us that we can build on.
Very well put. I like how you said that. And again, a very good point as well. So getting back to the site itself here, there are the potential for other mounds and features to be here, but this area was heavily affected by plowing and agriculture. So as far as other features on the property, do we have any indication of there being other mounds here on the site?
There are other mounds on the site, and some of the tree lines around the Chief's Mound itself. There's a small mound that had a big pot hunter's hole in it. There has not been much excavation done because of the location of it. And there's also an idea that there's a mound in the cemetery that was from one of the modern communities on the site. And as far as that, there's been records of about 18 to 20 other mounds that would have been on the site scattered around in front of the mound itself. But due to modern construction and plowing and farming, they've all been destroyed.
So we talked about in front of the mound there. So it's also controversial as to whether or not this site was big enough or significant enough to have the Mississippian Plaza that we see at so many other sites. So what does the archaeology tell us about the potential for there being a plaza here?
Well, there's not been a lot of artifacts found directly in front of the mound in the plaza, so in the area that would be the plaza. So they assume that, that's pretty typical. You're not going to find many there. But in that area, they did find a Spanish artifact, the chevron bead, but it was after a road grader had gone through. So, but they don't have the typical features of the plaza site.
We have a lot of anomalies here. Again, a significant site that has a lot of its own unique features, such as the moat, palisades, other things like that. But then also, we don't necessarily see everything that we would expect to find at a typical Mississippian site. But nonetheless, the history here and everything that's happened on this site, from modern communities all the way back to the 1500s, with the potential for De Soto coming through here. So let's pick the conversation up with De Soto. So De Soto has sort of built up over the years this image, this mythical image of this, moving through Florida up across the Appalachians and then down through the Mississippi, kind of building this almost hero status. I couldn't help but notice on the way here, there was counties named De Soto over in Mississippi. Hernando was used for exits and just different things I saw on the way here this morning. So let's talk about that first. Before we get to the story of De Soto coming here to Parkin, what are your thoughts on the fact that he has sort of been mythologized into this almost hero type of character?
That's something that's kind of changed throughout my life because you mentioned the counties. There's even the De Soto Bridge going across the Mississippi. And when I was younger, I was in Boy Scouts. We were in the De Soto Area Council. And all of our campsites were named after. We had a Cortez campsite, and we had all these other conquistadors that we had them named after. I never thought much of it as a kid. But as I got older, and I realized what these explorers were, it's kind of a double-edged sword. We got a lot of information from De Soto about the American Indians that we would not have got otherwise. But he also, killed a lot of them, captured them, and spread disease. So and it was traumatic and bad for their civilization.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we get back to the De Soto connection, or believed proposed connection to here at Parkin, pick it up with that story. So he came through this area. We know he was certainly moving through Arkansas at the time. What is the evidence for De Soto being here at the Parkin site?
Well, the evidence, there's a pretty substantial amount. They found, I mentioned the chevron bead earlier. It's the only bead in Arkansas that's been associated with the De Soto expedition. And it's been proven to be the De Soto bead instead of a later French one. There's also a few pieces of lead shot that have been found on the site that are from the Iberian Peninsula. And there's also been a Clarksdale bell and a whole one, and then fragments of those found on the site as well.
When you come here to the museum at the site, they have a beautiful display of these artifacts, and we're going to talk more about that coming up here in a moment, but you're going to be able to see much of what we're talking about here. Again, a very beautiful museum, a lab, lots of great things going on here at Parkin that we're going to get into. But as we're, again, describing the site to you, you have a very significant mound. What is the size of the mound right now, Nathan?
It's about 25 feet tall right now.
Okay, so about 25 feet. And estimates that it originally may have been closer to 35 or 40, is that correct?
Yeah, original reporting had it about 40 feet tall, but that we think that was a little exaggerated, so they think around more 30, 35 feet would have been better.
So in modern times, we're at how many feet?
About 25 feet.
with estimates that during the time of occupation, it may have been as high as 35 or 40?
Yeah, closer to 35 or 40. And then just due to modern erosion or natural erosion and the modern site that lived here, people playing on the mounds, pot hunters doing on that, it's just kind of worn down over time. Yeah,
well, let's get into that a little bit, because while the site is obviously significant for the archaeology, there was also a lot of modern agriculture. There was some industrial things that were built here on the site, as well as a housing community. So let's talk about that a little bit and how that played into the preservation of the site. So what was the name of the community that was ultimately built here in modern times?
Yeah. So there was a community that was built here called the Sawdust Hill Community. And that was built directly on top of the 17-acre site, upwards of 60 buildings. There were houses, there was a church, general stores, a whole little thriving community. And that all started because of a sawmill that was on the south side of the site, the Northern Ohio Cooperage Lumber Company. And they were milling cypress trees and, doing that in the area. And they built housing for their workers on the site, and then once the sawmill went under, it continued being a community. And this led to some damage to the property, obviously if you're digging and building houses and stuff, and but ultimately it preserved it because the surrounding areas of this site is nothing but agricultural fields. So without the sawmill and without the Sawdust Hill community spawning from that, this would have been turned into fields, just like everything else.
And so some of the archaeology that was done on the moat area around the site has shown that the sawdust has literally helped preserve portions of that moat. Is that correct? Is that a good interpretation of how it was used?
Yeah, it is. If you dug down into the moat, under all the layers of dirt and clay and everything, you would find a layer of thick sawdust. And that's from the sawmill. They had wagon loads of sawdust that they would collect, and they would just go dump it in the moat. And archaeologists found that and are able to date the moat when they dig. They can date it with that layer.
Yeah, very interesting sometimes how, the modern advent of what we would consider urban sprawl can sometimes, in rare occasions, like we see here, actually end up saving some sites because otherwise this ultimately probably would have just been turned into a giant agricultural community, and it would have been mostly gone or destroyed. As you see here, this whole entire area is surrounded by, millions of acres of agriculture. Right. So it's very fortunate that this site was able to be maintained in the way that it has. So continuing the discussion of the archaeology and the artifacts, what is the history of modern archaeology at the site? How long have official archaeological excavations been going on here, and who is the responsible archaeologist?
So the Arkansas Archaeological Society has kind of not ownership, but they're the ones that are overseeing all the archaeology done at the site. Dr. Jeff Mitchum, he was the leading archaeologist. He's retired this year. But he was the leading archaeologist on the modern digs from the 90s up to the present. But before that, there were excavations done in the 60s. And then before that, there have been, countless explorers and pot hunters going back all the way to the 1880s at this site.
So getting into some of the advanced modern technology, has this site been used at all as far as, LiDAR, GPR, anything that's non-invasive scanning on the site to kind of get a better idea of what's here?
They have done penetrating radar. They've done it on the mound to see what is going on in the mound without having to take it apart. But a lot of the readings are off when you scan the site because of all of the modern community that lived here, and there's just so many layers of history. And then the modern artifacts, the metal and things like that, it throws off all the readings.
Okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. So again, that modern settlement has protected the community, but also it creates some issues as far as that non-invasive archaeology goes. So it's a double-edged sword. Now, before we move on, I do want to return to something concerning the mound itself. So again, when you come here to the site, you make your way through this beautiful museum that they have in Visitor Center. You're going to go out and you're going to see the primary mound right in front of you. Very striking and beautiful mound. Freshly mowed, has 7 ages, was coming in today, so it's beautiful to see it there on the landscape. But there is something there on the mound that was discovered up on top of the mound that was related back to the journals of De Soto. That is a very interesting story concerning a drought that was going on when they came through. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So with De Soto, his chronicles say that Koski and his village in province was experiencing a 7-year drought. And that one of the reasons Koski went out to greet De Soto and be friendly with him was that he wanted to have De Soto pray to his God to bring rain down. And so De Soto obliged, being the evangelic Catholic that he was, and he had his Dominican priests with him that he brought. So they created a large cross of bald cypress that they raised on the mound, and they held mass, and then they said that the next day it rained. So that's the story from De Soto. And then the story from archaeology is that on the mound, they did diggings back in the 60s, and they found pieces of a post hole of a cypress tree that was in there, and they were able to determine it as a cypress tree. And then later on, more recently, they were able to do carbon dating, and it dates within 100 years of 1541. So it matches up with the written accounts of De Soto with the geography and the physical aspects they find in the mound itself.
Wow, that is truly fascinating. And when you go out here and you take a look at the property and you sort of envision, the Spanish here intermingling with the natives and then something like that taking place right there on the mound, it is certainly striking to the imagination, to say the least. As we get into some more of the anomalies of the site here, we're going to return back to the Sawdust Hill community for a moment, because as we were going around, there's this large patch of concrete that I noticed that is kind of just laid out there as part of the property. And there is a story connected to that of Miss Rosie Lee Patterson. So tell us about that patch of concrete and who was Rosie Lee?
So Rosie Lee was a member of the Sawdust Hill community. She lived here, and that patch of concrete out there is part of her carport of her house that used to be there. And she struck a deal with the Arkansas Archaeology Survey that they could move her house, physically move her whole house into Parkin, and then they could have that land that they thought would be relatively undisturbed because she'd been living there for so long. So then they were able to do excavations, and they found underneath her house, they found an American Indian house that had associated burials, and they found artifacts in there.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. So again, if you make your way out here to Parkin and you see that patch of concrete, just like me, you would probably be like, why in the world is there a patch of modern concrete? And then you'll get the story. And, the reason that it's still there is because they're concerned about just preserving anything else that's beneath that concrete. Is that correct?
Right, correct. Because they found burials right beside it. So they assumed that there would be more burials, possibly other structures there. And until they can actually fully, properly excavate it, they're going to leave the concrete there to protect it.
Okay, again, makes sense. And then also, Nathan, you explained to me as we came out of the visitor center and made our way toward the mound, that the sidewalk was even placed here in a very specific manner to not disturb the original soil. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty common question we get on our tours, is that if this is such an important archaeology site, why did we pave a sidewalk all across it? And, that even baffled me when I was first here. But what it is that they brought in fill dirt from a different site and they actually raised up the part where they're going to put the sidewalk about a whole foot or so. So that way when they dig down to put to lay the concrete in, it's not actually disturbing the ground surface. It's on top of it.
Yeah, so forward thinking and making sure that they're preserving as much of the site as possible. Again, highly commendable here at Parkin Mounds. Now, there are so many things that I want to talk about here. Something that is unique to this site, as well as some of the surrounding sites in the area, is the presence of these absolutely magnificent head pots. Now, if you're not familiar with these, I encourage you to go look up some images. I'm going to post some on our Instagram and our Facebook so that everybody can see what we're talking about. These are absolutely striking artifacts. And so many of them have been found here on this very property and some of the surrounding property. So let's begin there. What exactly is the head pot and what do we think it was used for?
Oh, that's a great question. So, yeah, head pots are very distinct of this area of Mississippian culture, especially northeast Arkansas. Lots of head pots have been found here. And ultimately, what it is at face value is a clay pot that has been shaped to look like a human head. They usually have very distinct features. Each one looks different, completely different, so we can assume it was based on a real person. They show hairstyles. They even have ear piercings. Facial looks like scarring or tattooing on the pots themselves. So we get a pretty good idea of what the Mississippians actually looked like.
Yeah, again, as we've been on this mound tour, the earlier part of the year and now here, we have really begun to realize how extensive the artwork was during the Mississippian. And when you come here, these artifacts are authentic and they're strikingly beautiful. And there is a particular head pot that you will see on display here at Parkin Mounds that they refer to lovingly as Charlie. So first of all, what is the story of Charlie, and then why is he named such?
Well, Charlie, the story of him is that the house we were talking about with Miss Rosie Lee Patterson, he was actually found with that burial underneath the house, 6 inches underneath the surface, and he was found intact. And his name is Charlie because he kind of looks like Charlie Brown. He's got a round head like him.
He absolutely does. And so if you come here and you have that in mind, you'll see exactly what Nathan means when he says Charlie. But again, folks, think about that. That house was literally sitting on top of this. And then when they went in to do the excavation, this fully intact pot is just there beneath this home after all these years. And, just thinking how long it's been sitting there and what are the chances of it still being in such remarkable condition. And then for you to be able to come here and see it is a truly unique reason. If nothing else alone, it's worth coming out here to Parkin to see these beautiful head pots in the museum that they have here with all of these magnificent things on display. So like you said, Nathan, there's a lot of things that we're able to see about the culture. There's religious iconography, there's effigy pots, there's all sorts of high art and beautiful things. Now, one of the things that you mentioned is the ear piercings that we see on these head pots, as well as the hairstyle, the potential for scarring or facial tattoos. And then you even have a head pot here in the display with Charlie that is missing the ears, but there's some really interesting parts that we're able to see about the artwork itself on that particular pot. So tell us about the missing ear pot.
So with that pot, that's one of the examples I use when I talk about why I don't like the word primitive, harkening back to earlier, is that you can see their advanced clay techniques that are still used by modern potters. So where his ears were, you can see outlines of them, and you see the score marks on the clay where they would have been connected. So at some point in the firing process, the ears fell off. So it's historically broken. It's not from a modern excavation or anything.
That teaches us so much, and it's so fascinating, folks. When you come here and you see this, you can literally get to see this artifact, and you can see each line that the artist put in there to attach the ears onto the head. And, it's remarkable that you get to see something that didn't take during the firing because it gives you the insight to how it was done, why it was done. And again, one of those unique things that you need to get out here and see, because these aren't things that you get to see. First of all, head pots, several of them have been found in various conditions, but the condition of the ones that are here, along with the unique features such as that, really make this a truly special destination. I want to return for a moment to some of the Spanish artifacts. Now, you mentioned the lead shot, and you talked about the bead. I have seen one of those beads before off the French Broad River over there in Tennessee, and yes, they do look very, very similar. But there was also the bell that you talked about earlier that was found here on the property. What context was that bell found, and where was it at on the property?
So the bell was found with a child burial, and it was on a necklace around the neck of the child. So we're not too sure as to why. Was this child important? Was it the son of a chief or something like that? To have such a revered, artifact the Spanish were trading probably would have been a very important person.
Yes, for sure. And then again, if you come here to the museum, they have this on display. Now, I keep talking about the museum for one specific reason. One, it's beautifully laid out. There's lots of beautiful artifacts and interpretation here. But also the artifacts that are on display here are authentic to the region and to the site. So tell us a little bit about how that is able to be the case, because as we've made our way from site to site, we have seen under NAGPRA, some of these burial items have been completely removed from various sites. And in other cases, some of them have replicas of those in the cases. And in a couple of cases, we've even seen where the local indigenous groups and cultures would not even allow a replica to be placed into the case. So how is it that you're able to display authentic artifacts here at the Parkin Museum?
Right. So that's something that's constantly evolving that we have to always be aware of, and that requires communication with the tribes. And this one is the Quapaw Nation. So under NAGPRA, they have ownership of all Native American artifacts and remains in the northeastern quadrant of Arkansas, where we're at. And so they have agreements that we can display the burial goods because it is a continuation of their culture, showing their history, their art, their religion. So they want us to be able to show it to the public so the public can be aware of that. But on the other hand, they do have the right to take any of these artifacts and they can take them, display them somewhere for themselves, or they can reinter them. So with that, we actually have a reinterment site on the actual site that's been dedicated as an actual cemetery, and the Quapaw Nation has done a cleansing ceremony for it. So at any point, they can reinter any of the remains that have been found here, and any of the artifacts that they determine need to be, they can make that decision.
Again, this is the type of thing that I think is so vitally important for the preservation of the story of the indigenous people of North America, as well as the ability for those of us interested in archaeology, academia, all of those involved in the community to work together for the betterment and the education of the public. So I commend the program that you have going on here. I think it's remarkable, again, that you've done everything that you could possibly do here at Parkin to work with the local indigenous communities, to have them be a part and take ownership of the property, even though it's a state park, to keep people involved. And I think that's vitally important to the preservation of the story of the indigenous people of North America. Now, we're not going to discuss exactly where that reinterment area is here on the property. If you do come here, I'm sure they would be happy to tell you more about it. But, just so you know, there is a very distinct area for these reinterments to occur in the case that they would be necessary in the future. And again, I think this is a way forward for archaeology and the Native communities continue to work together in the future. So certainly commend you here at Parkin for doing those type of things and having the involvement of your local communities of indigenous people. So as we move on here with the site, there's so much to see. There's so much in the region. The story of Parkin continues to grow. There is a lab that you have here on the property. Again, we've only seen this in a very few instances at other places, but built right into the visitor center here, you have a archaeological lab that's also telling the story of the Parkin archaeological site. So tell us a little bit about the lab. What has it been used for in the past, and what is the idea for it in the future?
So the lab here is owned by the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, and it's a research station attached to the state park. And they do all sorts of archaeology work back there. They do sorting of artifacts, washing, IDing them, and cataloging them as they need to. And that is from either local sites where that they've done excavations in the past few years, or even just helping out around the state. If another research station is overburdened with all of their artifacts, they'll ship some over, and they'll do that here.
Another great addition to the site here. So again, I encourage everyone to get out, support your local sites, do some history research about the area that you live in, and make sure that you get out there, you see these sites, you get involved. Many times there's volunteer opportunities. Lots of times there's programs and events that are going on at historical sites all over the country. So check your calendars, make sure that you're getting involved with those. Great for children, great for students. There's lots of things for you to be involved with. So Nathan, as we're wrapping up here, talking about the beautiful site of Parkin Mounds here in Arkansas, tell us how we can learn more about the site. What websites do you have available? Do you have any events or anything coming up here in the future?
So the best way to keep up with us is to go to arkansasstateparks.com, and you'll be able to use their Park Finder feature and select Parkin Archaeological, and that'll take you to our homepage, and it'll have an events section that'll show anything that we're doing. This weekend that you're here, actually, we're having a clay workshop, calling it a wild clay workshop, where we're partnering with some local colleges and universities, and they're coming here. And the public will get involved, and the idea is to do the as authentic as possible to make Mississippian pottery. So we do workshops like that. We also do workshops based on like sandal weaving of Native American designs, basket weaving, different things like that throughout the year. We work with a lot of school groups, and if you just want to keep up with us, you can email us directly at parkin@arkansas.com.
All right, there it is, folks. So get out there, support your local site, support everyone here at Parkin. And again, Nathan Odom, park interpreter here at the Parkin Archaeological State Park in beautiful Northeast Arkansas. So again, Nathan, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. And again, appreciate the tour, appreciate everything that you're doing here at the site. So thanks again for having us and for joining us here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that interview. Always great to hear from the fine experts out there in the field, enlightening us, and also deepening our knowledge of the earthenwork builders of the ancient Americas. Guys, I'm just glad that this holiday season I did not get a visit from the Krampus, the wicked, the notorious Krampus. You guys know about Krampus, don't you?
Oh, yeah.
Is it weird that I kind of maybe would want a visit from him just once, just to see how it works out?
I could understand. I just want to understand really what Krampus is. Some would argue he is a Sasquatch. Some would argue that he is some sort of a strange liminal being from another dimension. I wonder if there's an archaeology of the Krampus. Really, we could argue maybe that he is just kind of one of those many iterations of the wild man, or the woodwose as they were known in the British Isles and in the folklore of Europe. But then again, that's just speculation on my part. I'm sure we could dig deeper and we could probably find out all about Krampus, but in my case, I'm just glad I didn't get a visit from him because, with that tongue and the horrific appearance, it might have startled me, chilled me to the bone, and, had I been frightened badly enough, gentlemen, I might not have been able to be here in the Crosstime Pub with you this evening.
Well, nothing's going to keep us from that. Krampus, if you've never seen him, he basically would have been welcome on any 1980s metal band album cover.
Yeah. Absolutely would have. And actually that long tongue that Krampus possesses would have given Gene Simmons, bass player of Kiss, a run for his money. And although I said it might scare me so bad I couldn't be here, if I did really actually encounter a Christmas Krampus, I think the very thing I would need would be a strong drink from the Crosstime Pub. But with that in mind, it's time for us to observe our own tradition here in the Crosstime Pub, and for the last time in 2022, because when we gather together here again, it will be an all-new year as we continue our pursuit of answers about the ancient past. On behalf of James Waldo, Jason Pentrail, I am yours truly, Micah Hanks. We are the 7 Ages Research Associates. We'll see you guys next year, and as always, keep asking questions about history as we do right here, always on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.